Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back at the ASU GSV Summit a week later and to be joined by Tony West. I usually was in the position of having Tony ask me lots of questions about what we were doing in terms of civil rights at the Justice Department. And so it's a pleasure to be able to talk with him about what he's been doing during his time at Uber and around the country in this moment. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Anurima. It's great to see you and great to be with you.
Yes. So, I mean, it's an extraordinary time. So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be able to see you, and I'm looking forward to be able to see you in other parts of my TV screen this week. So let's just get into it. I worked with Tony in the Justice Department. We did a lot of work on sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. Obviously, also a lot of work on discrimination in many other forms too. And we've both gone off in the world and tried to figure out how we continue some of this work in different ways. And Tony, you joined Uber right after both of our former boss, Eric Holder, had done a report on what had happened at Uber. I heard you describe when you came into Uber in 2017 in an interview last year as a hot mess. And so my first question was, is it a hot mess, or is it a hot mess in a dumpster fire, in a train wreck kind of hot mess? And so let's just start there.
It was kind of all of the above. there was the dumpster fire. One of the things that was so funny is there came a point where I just wasn't surprised anymore when you'd open up a closet and another skeleton would fall out. Like, okay, all right, okay, there's that one. But look, I think the thing about the place was a lot of these were legal problems, which a lot of them came from self-inflicted wounds. A lot of these were issues that had to do with the culture of the place that was broken, and all of that meant to Dara Khosrowshahi, the new CEO, to me, to other people who came in, what that meant is that these were actually fixable issues. I'm always careful not to say that, we have fixed everything at Uber, or, we've fixed the culture or anything like that, because the reality is doing that is a constant effort and requires constant vigilance. And as soon as you sort of take your eye off the culture ball, you're likely to lose it. So you've always got to make sure you're continuing to hold yourself accountable to certain values and principles. And that's really what we've tried to do. I mean, I think, when we came in, Dara, wanted to set a tone from the top that really prioritized safety and create a safety culture. There was a sort of a cultural norm or a North Star for us called "Do the Right Thing." Period. You'll find that to be a very familiar kind of North Star, having come from the Justice Department, Anurima. And one reason why I found that guiding principle to be so compelling is because of my experience at the Justice Department. And what it telegraphed to people is that there would be a new guiding principle that people would have to hold themselves accountable to. And so when I came in, I talked a lot about what do the right thing meant. It meant acting with transparency, integrity, and accountability in everything that we did. And it was very important for us not just to say that over and over again, which we did, but also to act consistently with those values and with what we were saying. We'd have to walk the talk. And so, sometimes, that was just sort of second nature because we believed in it. Sometimes it was really hard because it required us to do things that were difficult, things that, other companies weren't doing, but which indeed, did enhance transparency, were done with integrity, did require us to be held accountable. And so, that's becoming the DNA of the company as we kind of continue to focus on, all of the core issues of safety, but obviously deal with new challenges like COVID and this reckoning around race that we're currently in.
Right, and I want to talk a little bit about, in some ways it was a 180 in terms of values and some of the values that had already been in place. And so thinking about the values of really hustling and being in competition with one another and trying to be out there. And how did you start to think about not only introducing a new set of values, also really trying to figure out how to embed them in the context of something that had been structured in a very, very different way? And so just walk us through sort of how did you translate those values? How did you actually try and embed them? In what ways did that process start? And maybe even if you want to talk about how they've been sustained in the years you've been there, I think that would be helpful too.
Sure. Well, I think it started with being just very clear about what your expectations were, and modeling the behavior that you expected to see in the organization. When I went in, I did a lot of listening, and I traveled all around to meet the entire team. As the chief legal officer, I have responsibility for the legal team, the compliance and ethics team, as well as the security team, both physical security and cyber security. And we're spread all over the world. And so I spent a lot of time going and really kind of trying to understand what were the values that this organization was operating on, and what did we need to retain, because there were some very solid values that you wanted to retain, but what did we need to change as well? And that led me, after about 3 or 4 months, to completely change my entire leadership team. And one of the things I would say it was really important is as a value was inclusion and diversity. That I believed very strongly that diverse teams are stronger teams, that they make better decisions, that if you look at anything from Harvard Business School to McKinsey to all these studies that talk about the vibrancy, dynamism, and financial returns of diverse teams. And so one of the things that we talked about a lot was how that has to be embedded in the DNA. And what better way to do that than to model that behavior? So the first hire that I made actually kind of telegraphed to people that I was very serious about the cultural change and about diversity. The first person I hired was my deputy general counsel, a woman named Tammy Albaron. Tammy is a brilliant lawyer, someone I've actually known for about 25 years, and had known when I was in private practice. We practiced together. And I say she's actually one of these people that I kept trying to hire when I was at the Justice Department, but it was always out of bad time where she couldn't make the move to Washington. But even more importantly, the Holder report that we talked about briefly in the opening, she's the one who wrote that report, because she was at Covington and was working closely with Eric to conduct the investigation at Uber, interviewed all the employees, knew our culture better than anybody else. And I wanted to make it clear that we were going to be serious about implementing those recommendations, and we were going to be serious about changing the culture. So making her my partner, my right hand, was an important step in that direction. And in terms of the diversity, not only is she Latina, it kind of telegraphs that, listen, we're going to get the best and the brightest. And when we do that, it's going to be a diverse team. And so now we have 14 members of our leadership team, 9 of whom are women. And we continue to demonstrate that we can both have a culture that is inclusive and a culture that is strong, and a culture that's diverse. So you're really kind of walking the talk when it came to putting these things in practice, and never passing up an opportunity to demonstrate that transparency, integrity, accountability, these 3 touchstones really do drive the way that we're going to think about the business. So another good example is within our first year, Odara and I, within the first year that we were at the company, there was a very tragic accident involving one of our autonomous vehicles in Arizona, and it killed a pedestrian, a woman named Mrs. Hertzberg. And this autonomous vehicle, which we've been testing in cities around the country, we grounded that fleet. So we took those off the street. And one of the real questions was, what kind of safety culture did we have at our autonomous vehicles division? And was safety the main driver? And, it's very common for companies, whether it's, after there's a an air accident, aviation companies, after there's, some kind of energy accident, oil and gas company. It's very common for companies to do an after action and to do a report to look at root causes. And usually that is done under the cloak of privilege, because obviously people don't want to create a bunch of liability for themselves. We made the decision fairly early on, Dara and I, that we were going to do that after action report. We were going to hire independent people to come in and look at the safety culture of ATG, but we were not going to put that report under privilege. We were going to actually release it publicly. And the reason we decided to do that was not only because we wanted to demonstrate that transparency really does mean what we believe it means. It means something. It has teeth. But we also knew we were setting a precedent in a nascent industry. It was the first autonomous vehicle that had involved the death of an individual. And so we knew the way we handled that incident would set a precedent for other companies coming down the road. And we decided that, hiring the former chairman of the NTSB to hire his own team to go into ATG and to have full access, not only to the employees, not only to our documents, but to really kind of understand our safety culture and to make findings, and then to make that public, that would be the right thing to do. And so that's what we did. And you can go and find that report on the internet today, and you'll see, it's very, very honest. It says there are some things that we did right, but there are many things that we didn't do right and we needed to improve. And those improvements have now been incorporated into our autonomous vehicles division. But it's that kind of, you're just making sure you're holding yourself accountable all the time, which begins to build credibility with your employee base so that they now know that, you're serious about that.
So you started to talk about this. One of the things that really struck me about how Uber engaged here is to really think about the culture of safety instead of a culture of liability. Exactly. And just to take this back for a moment, I mean, when we were doing work around campuses and schools, which is something that a lot of our audience is where they spend their time, there was this constant tension around really trying to figure out a simple problem. And the problem that we were trying to fix is that most people don't report. Most young people didn't report. They didn't come forward. So you didn't actually have the information to know what was happening to be able to address it. And that meant that trying to provide a safe and supportive environment for young people, in the cases of schools, was a hard thing to do. Of course, on the flip side is that there was this great concern, and it continues to be, about liability. And so how do you actually really think about this balancing of safety and liability, and frankly, in the context of, when numbers go up, and this is something that you also talked about, when numbers go up, people start to think there's a worse problem and that you're somehow not doing the right thing, to go back to the first principle here, where in fact having numbers go up and knowing what's happening is incredibly important for safety. So if you could just talk a little bit about this, how you thought about that in the context of both your users, but also internally at Uber, safety, liability, and how we actually maybe ground something different than worrying about liability all the time as lawyers or as movers in this space.
Exactly. No, and look, I mean, it's not easy. I'm not going to pretend like it's easy, because it's not. It's hard, and it involves very real world trade-offs, and it does involve cost. But it's also a decision that I think you have to make. When Dara made the decision that we were going to put safety first at the heart of our Uber culture, then there are a number of other decisions which flowed from that, right? And there were a number of other effects which naturally were the result of that one very important decision. One of those was one that I was very interested in pursuing, and it really does come out of the work that I did with you and with others around campus sexual assault, and then the work that I've done around sexual assault, sexual violence, for my entire career, was the platform safety when it came to women. Because in my mind, and I know in the minds of many others, we know that women experience travel differently than men. The New York Times has reported on this. There are many studies that kind of are out there that talk about the fact that women simply have to consider things that men just don't think about or have to think about when they're moving through the world. And that's particularly important for a platform like ours, which helps to facilitate movement, which is sort of at the core of the proposition. And so if safety is going to be our central value, central animating principle as a company, what does that mean for women's safety? That means we've got to improve the platform's safety for women. And if you do that, then you're actually succeeding. And so that led us to meet with 200 plus women's and sexual violence prevention groups around the country to talk about how do we begin to overhaul our safety support systems and our app so that it is survivor-centric, so that it is not only ensuring that we're getting better information about what's happening on our platform so that we can take action to address it, but also how do we make sure that the experience is such that not only do women and riders feel safer, but if they ever are in a situation that is unsafe, there are things that they can do immediately to help rectify that situation. And so that led to those consultations led to a whole host of things. They led to product changes. So a whole host of safety features that we've introduced in the past couple of years. In fact, more safety features I think in the last 2 or 3 years than we had introduced in the previous 8. Things like the PIN verification, ride check, the emergency button, very practical tools that are accessible right on the app. So you had product changes, but then you also had policy changes. And so, again, within 6 months of my being at Uber, we announced that we would end the use of arbitration for claims of sexual assault and sexual harassment. That we would allow survivors to choose their form. If they wanted to choose arbitration, fine, but they would not be forced into arbitration. We also ended the use of confidentiality agreements when it came to sexual assault and sexual harassment, so that a survivor, again, is not stripped of the agency to be able to tell her story or his story, that they make that choice. And so those were really important decisions. To your point, they definitely had a cost because they did expose us to more liability, quite candidly. But we also thought it was important from a cultural shift, and not just for our company. It was important to do that to sort of set a new bar in the tech industry. And so, I'm happy to say that other companies, not long after that announcement, began to follow suit and announced that they were no longer using forced arbitration, no longer using confidentiality agreements when it came to these sexual assault or sexual harassment claims. And now that's become sort of the new standard, which is great, which is exactly what you want, right? You want to completely get to a place where we're now trying to clear a different and higher bar. But the other thing that came out of it was what I think is a real contribution to the space of sexual violence prevention, and that is the taxonomy. One of the things that you and I grappled with, Anurima, is that when you start to talk about sexual violence and you start to talk about whether it's campus sexual violence or other sexual violence, one thing you quickly learn is that there are no uniform definitions that are used by either college campuses or law enforcement organizations. That oftentimes, right, the same behavior is categorized very differently, and the implications of that is that it's very difficult to get really good data. Frankly, it's very difficult to get consistent data to really kind of understand what's going on in society. And if you don't have consistent data, then it's very difficult to come up with best practices and things that you can share that will actually reduce the level of violence, sexual violence in our society. And so working with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, working with Reliance, which is an umbrella group of sexual violence prevention groups, working with advocates in the field, we were able to come up with a behavior-based taxonomy or categorization of behaviors that then allowed, when applied to our platform, allowed us to accurately begin to categorize reports that we were getting of what was going on our platform. And the thing that I think is the reason I say it's such a contribution is because it's not just a taxonomy that can be used by Uber. And in fact, other companies have now begun to use it. It can be used by any company or organization that brings strangers together in a common space to begin to really understand what's happening when it comes to sexual violence in these spaces. And then that allows you to begin to come up with solutions, right? That can be shared. And so that's why I think it was such an important step, because it gave us a tool now that previously we did not have, and which is now available for organizations. Even law enforcement could use it if they wanted to. But it wasn't. What was important is that it wasn't driven by law enforcement. I think one of the things that we find, right, is that when you have definitions of sexual misbehavior that are driven by sort of a legal kind of a definition, what you're always focused on then is, whether or not someone has actually tripped that definition or broken the law, or whether or not, you can prosecute that case, which is how a lot of these definitions have come about. That leaves a lot of violence, sexual violence, on the table that's unaddressed. And so, we had to make sure that we were capturing all of that as well, so that we could not only get a clear picture of what was happening on the platform, but also begin to develop the best ways, again, in partnership with these groups, to address it. The last thing I'll say about this is that, this is what it means, I think, to be a real survivor-centric organization. Because one decision we made early on, and again, this was informed by the advocates we were working with and trying to make sure we were doing this in the best way, was to make sure we were counting all reports of sexual assault or sexual harassment without regard to whatever the outcome of those incidents were. So, we were not only, counting at what people would say, proven or, validated, or what. We weren't worried about that. We were really focused on the report itself. Because what it meant is our principle there was that you believe survivors. And if you believe survivors, you take that report, it has merit, and you include it in your metrics. Because again, it gives you a clearer sense of what's happening on the platform. And so I think that was a really important decision to make at the outset. Doesn't mean that, as people would say to me, some GCs at other companies, wow, I mean, are you being over-inclusive? Well, it depends on what you mean by over-inclusive. We wanted to understand
what the standard is.
Exactly. What's the standard, right? Exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, we wanted to understand what was happening on our platform. We wanted to understand what survivors were telling us. We wanted to have a clear picture of that. And so that's why we drew the line that way.
Tony, when I think about all this, I think about it as just basically having the beginning of this conversation flow all the way through, which is, if you're actually thinking about a culture of safety, then your definitions aren't legal definitions. Your definitions are the ones that are going to actually have you look at what's going on to make sure you have a safer environment for everyone. It also means you don't look at whether someone can prove up what it is that they're raising. Exactly. You say, the goal is safety. We want to know what's happening. And if we want to know what's happening, let's figure out what's the best way in which that information can come forward. And one of the things that I think is also important for people to realize about how you're intervening is really thinking about prevention. And so if someone has something that was raised regarding a rider or a driver, to actually make sure they get educational modules so that it doesn't happen again, right? So that we're not in a situation where we're waiting for a whole legal process to play out to figure out if that person should get some training or should have some intervention occur. We're just basically saying, there's an issue that's been raised. Let's know what's happening, and let's make sure people have some resources to figure out how they do this better right now.
That's exactly right. That's exactly.
And so I think that the really, I mean, it's important to think about from like the beginning to the end, the way that the values that you talked about, transparency, accountability, integrity, and this culture of safety then flows through all the way to how easy it is to be able to report on an app, right? Like it's all aligned. And I think the alignment makes such a difference in terms of whether or not you're going to actually have a change that's embedded instead of a change that's off on the side. And that's actually the other thing I wanted to ask you, just to go back for a moment. In this moment that we're in, where we're in multiple pandemics and reckonings, and the ground is shifting for every hour, it feels like. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is that we saw this summer a lot of performative statements, a lot of commitments, some donations, some very large donations to efforts to civil rights efforts, to women's rights efforts, to certainly lots of racial justice organizations. And one of the things, the other thing we saw a lot of was the setting up of diversity task forces and hiring diversity officers and thinking about processes that are going to make places, diverse, inclusive, and equitable. I wanted to ask you about how you thought about this, because I think one of the other things that's important is if those are efforts that come up, they can also get stalled or they get sidelined, especially when we're in the middle of resource constraints. And I think the way in which Uber was able to center and then embed some of this work to really sustain it is important. So I just wanted to see if you had some thoughts on how we get away from the performative and the checklist to really thinking about how you transform an organization and have this be something that's part of its, not only its North Star, but part of its DNA.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think part of it is accountability. And so if you think about, how do we become a survivor-centric company and culture when it comes to safety? One important thing was to commit early on that we were going to release our numbers publicly, which was a big unknown, right? Because you just didn't know what the reaction was going to be. And no one likes to talk about sexual violence anyway, but then to kind of say, hey, look, this is what's happening on our platform. We know that there are things that we need to do to address it. That's just not typically, frankly, the way companies, private corporations tend to operate. But that public accountability is really, really important. Because I will say that it was a moment of great pride for so many within our company. I got so many emails of people saying, I've never been more proud to work at Uber than I am at this moment, when we're willing to say, hey, listen, this is the issue. It's a societal issue, but the only way that we can begin to address it is by being public about it, because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I kind of feel the same way about this issue on race, right? I think the way that we begin, I think writing the checks is fine, and organizations can use the money, and I'm glad we're doing that. But as I've said before, and I've said it about my own company as well as the tech industry generally, which is that what's really important is not what we do in the heat of this moment. What's really important is what we are doing to advance racial equity and to be an anti-racist company next year and the year after that, when all of the protests have died down, when people have gone back to their normal lives, and when it's not on the front page of the news. And that's really going to be the real test of whether or not we met this moment with some real, with some real action that matters. And so, what we've done is we've made a number of commitments, public commitments, about how internally and externally we are going to be an anti-racist company. And we're doing that because, again, when you think about what kind of platform Uber is, it's about movement. I mean, movement is the essential ingredient to one's liberty interest. And it's about the movement of people. It's about the movement of things. And so for us, it's very inherent in our mission that we believe that you cannot effectively carry out that mission. And you cannot effectively be the kind of company you want to be if you're not actively trying to be anti-racist. And so we've made these public commitments, both about what we think we need to do internally in terms of opening the pipeline, in terms of increasing representation of Black executives, in terms of other things that we're going to be doing internally, and then externally, commitments that we have made as well. And so look, I think we made them public so that people could say a year from now, where are you on these metrics? When we present our 2021, I'll give you a little sneak preview, don't tell anybody, when we present our 2021 internal goals for the company, as we'll do later this year, this will be one of the things that we're going to hold all of our leaders and each other accountable for helping to achieve real progress along the commitments that we've made. And so I think it's that accountability, that holding yourself, holding each other accountable to meeting these goals is what's really important.
Thank you, Tony. I know we're out of time, and I will just like to say I'm so grateful to have had the chance to have you as someone I could learn from about transparency and accountability and integrity and what it means to actually have a just place for all of us, and to see the way in which you've always done that collectively, and had it been something that is in every aspect of what people do and not something that's a sideline conversation. And so it's great to have you here and to have you be someone who's leading in this industry in tech and in education about how we actually do this work. And so I'm grateful for the personal example and for the national example that you've always shown us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anurima. It's so good to see you. Thanks.
Good to see you too.